let's talk a little bit about the book. You read the book, right?
Okay. Yep.
What are your initial impressions? Because it has some philosophical implications. It also has some economic implications. Kahneman, not that this counts for too much, but Kahneman did win a Nobel Prize in economics. So he joins Paul Krugman, I think, in that category. But just your general reaction to the book, and then we'll get into some detail.
I like it. So it's a mixed bag. I like the psychological analysis. I think a great deal of what he says in terms of how System 1 operates, I think is correct. What I don't like is some of the philosophic implications that he draws.
Welcome to the School Sucks Project, a podcast, YouTube channel, and online community dedicated to personal growth and intellectual self-defense.
We promote learning alternatives, home education, critical thinking, peaceful parenting, organization and productivity, and better communication strategies.
Please remember to visit schoolsucksproject.com to get comprehensive show notes, relevant links,
or to just leave comments.
Follow us on Twitter at SchoolSucksShow. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, username SchoolSucksPodcast, and get involved in our Facebook group. Just search for School Sucks Project.
So some of the philosophic implications, I think, go a little bit awry. In our culture, there's this very popular idea that humans are fundamentally irrational. We're illogical. And so people say, well, therefore, they draw all kinds of economic implications, which we can talk about. Say, well, you think you're doing accurate philosophy, but really you're just irrational. We can't know anything about anything. We're just these completely illogical creatures. That you get that flavor throughout the book. This is a very popular idea. I think it's mistaken. And there are some philosophic claims he makes about randomness that I think are completely incorrect. So in terms of just the analysis of like how System 1 works, I think is good. In terms of some of the broader implications, I think is not so good. So we can go through, if you like, some of the pros and cons.
Yeah, you know, before we started recording today, you used a phrase that I was a little bit curious about, the hot hand. And when we did the 5 Principles of Learning Anything series earlier this year, we talked a lot about performance in sports. And I feel like I know what the hot hand is, but can you go into detail about that and talk about what the problem was for you in the book?
Totally. This is the hot hand. No. The hot hand is a way of describing an athlete or a performer who's in the zone.
Right.
What that means is if somebody, you've got your basketball player who usually averages 15 points a game, but wow, this game, he's just everything he shoots is going in the basket. Or the golfer who's, every putt is a one putt. Every time he gets on the green, it's one putt. Or the jiu-jitsu guy that's getting everybody and the chokeholds making him tap out. Or the chess player that's just really deep into the position, doing everything right. Somebody that's in the zone, that person who has the hot hand. So like in sports or in football or in basketball, the idea is give the ball to the person with a hot hand because the person's going to be able to more accurately or more likely to score. In the book, he essentially says that there's no such thing as the hot hand. The hot hand is just a statistical anomaly. It's something that he calls it the regression to the mean, that it's just part of natural random luck that sometimes performers are going to do well and then they'll correct and not do so well. I think this is kind of silly. I think it's to be expected from somebody who's doing mathematical analysis in the abstract to say something like that. But you're not going to find virtually any athletes say that because they're not looking at things in the abstract. They're looking at things in the concrete. So the reason you get the hot hand, the reason you get in the zone is entirely a function of technique. It's because your technique is you're performing with a high level of technique. You're being very efficient, the principles we talked about before. Mm-hmm. And your focus isn't on minutia. Your focus is almost kind of just on the objective you're trying to accomplish, and you allow your subconscious to work. So, for example, if I'm in the middle of a really difficult chess position, if I'm thinking about if I'm super analyzing every single move in the concrete, and I'm not letting my System 1 do a lot of the intuitive, immediate, instant analysis, it's going to be really hard to be a good chess player. You have to set your mind up in such a way where your subconscious can do a lot of that immediate calculation, and your System 1 is free to do more important tasks. So it is in no way random that some people get in the zone and then they stay in the zone and then they get out of the zone. It is absolutely a function of technique. And in fact, people like Josh Waitzkin, who I mentioned before, talk about how to get in the zone. So it's a state that you can consciously try to get yourself in so that you are a higher performer. So I think this is something, I think it's a great failure, in fact, in the book, because it kind of comes up a lot. He implies that luck is a big part of how the world operates. I don't buy that in the slightest.
Right. So I worry that in the shows that I've done in this series so far, I've talked too negatively or too dismissively about System 1. Did you get the impression in your reading of the book that he assigns some value to System 1 beyond, I mean, we understand why this type of thinking exists, right? Like, there's a bear. Here comes a tsunami. You know, this volcano is erupting. How do I survive this situation? Right or wrong, I have to go forward right now. So obviously there's this kind of biosurvival cue involved in System 1, but did you get any other usefulness of this kind of thinking out of the book that's worth mentioning?
So I have a little bit of background in cognitive psychology, so I understand a lot of what he was talking about. So it's not particularly this book, I would say, wow, there's a lot of really new information in here for me. But the ideas that he's presenting, yes, I do not view, as I think he does and I think a lot of people do, System 1 and System 2 as somehow being antagonistic.
Yeah.
You have a lot of people, I think Kahneman included, that think really what's going on with humans is System 1, and then there's a little bit of System 2 out here that kind of, you know, somewhat can control our behavior, but really mainly in System 1. You have other people who think it's all System 2 and that it's a reptilian brain that is System 1 and we only need to focus on System 2. No. If you want to learn about the world, which is the thing that I like to do, there's this beautiful harmony between the two. In fact, the process of learning could be understood as taking the concepts that you grasp in System 2 and stuffing them into your System 1 so you don't have to think about them. So practice, for example, is about ingraining difficult concepts that you have to work through slowly and difficultly. You practice, and eventually you don't have to think about them anymore. They become part of your System 1. So there's this, and this is the case in philosophy especially. If you understand what logical fallacies look like, you don't have to every single time go through and analyze, okay, is this a valid argument? You just grasp it because you've done it a million times. That's wonderful. Like, System 1 is the best friend of System 2. And the other thing that I thought he gets a little bit incorrect here, and maybe not, maybe he's more friendly to System 2. System 2, the conscious mind, can totally dominate System 1. Mm-hmm. So, like when he was talking about, this is an excellent example. In fact, it incorporates the luck phenomena as well. He's talking about small businesses. He said, you know, something like 30 or 35% of small businesses go bankrupt. And then he points to the irrationality of small business owners, because when you ask them what's the likelihood of them going bankrupt, they give you a higher number. Oh, I think it's I think 80% chance it's going to succeed. And he says, oh, look, this is a case of irrationality. Well, that's just silly. In fact, he's got a line in the book where he says, essentially, I think this is verbatim, he says, these people think that the statistics do not apply to them. Mm-hmm. There's a reason for that. The statistics don't apply to you. The statistics are something that's in the hindsight meta-aggregate analysis, right? You miss the trees for the forest when you're thinking, oh, every business has a 30% chance of success. This is a very, very silly way of looking at the world. Yeah. There is a reason why the 30 or 35% of entrepreneurs succeed and the 60 or 65% of entrepreneurs don't succeed. And it's their technique. It's what they're doing. Right. And that technique can be controlled by your System 2. You just learn how the world works. You grasp the concepts, and then you can be that much closer to success. There's a luck involved.
Yeah, that comment on the aggregate is very important, because if you suddenly pulled in just a myriad of variables, or like all the variables that affected all those people that made up the 30% that succeeded and the 70% that didn't, you would see a lot of patterns emerge, as you brought in detail. Absolutely, of course. And I like what you said about System 1 too, is that it's kind of the automator / show off for what happens in the deeper level thinking. We're all so impressed when we watch a debate. Like somebody, Christopher Hitchens comes to mind. He was just masterful at not only being, insightful in the moment, but also witty and winning a crowd over, even a hostile crowd, because he had these amazing debate skills and how he could just pull this information out of the deep recesses of his mind. We're so impressed when we see people able to do this, even if once in a while, like, I feel like I could do that, but I don't know if I could do it on a stage in front of 500 people or something that was being televised. I might just freeze up. So I'm always very impressed by that. But it is the deeper system 2 work, the deliberation being shown off by a more automated system 1, which is a very, very cool thing to see. So I just wanted to get that into this show because I feel like after listening back to what I've done so far, are people going to like make this association between like system 1 and the caveman? And I don't want them to do that. I want them to see the interplay between the systems. So thanks for pointing that out.
Well, sure. And to piggyback off that, so there are 2 different ways of looking at what humans are. You can look at them fundamentally as animals, as essentially system 1 with a little bit of trickery around the edges, or you can look at them as system 2 things that can manipulate the animal. Right. So is it the case? This is the phrase that's been around for centuries. Is it the emotional tail wagging the rational dog? Mm-hmm. Right. And there's this idea, very, very popular nowadays, that it is the case that emotion, system 1 is primary and system 2 is really secondary, periphery. And some people would probably even say non-existent. Well, that ain't my view of how the world works. I think if you practice conscious deliberation, mastery of things, if you try to understand the world, you grasp philosophy, your system 2 is massively powerful, right? It is not the case. I mean, maybe, of course, in some sense, maybe we're all advanced cavemen, but we have an incredible ability to consciously manipulate our underlying subconscious process, right? The Christopher Hitchens example is an excellent case. This is true, right? When you see efficiency and relaxation in any high-level performance. If it's the golfer that has this buttery smooth golf swing, that it's not random chance. It's not the system 1 is somehow doing that on its own. It's that through a very deliberate, rational learning process, you have made it possible for that underlying system to operate. So I don't see any. I mean, I suppose in one sense, there's tension between system 1 and system 2, and that's when you're trying to grasp at the truth, when you're philosophizing. So if you're aware of what your system 1 is doing, if you're aware of your cognitive biases and you're aware of intuitive jumps in reasoning, you can correct them. You just have to become aware of them, work through them slowly, and correct them. So if you're going to be a philosopher and the only way that you're operating is, system 1, that subconscious process, you're not going to be a very good philosopher. But that in no way means that skill is not able to be developed.
You mentioned cognitive psychology a little bit, and is it possible to see a lot of what happens in system 1 as more of a doorway to the subconscious? I just think about exercises that I've done, like Nathaniel Branden's work comes to mind in his sentence stems, right? Where it's like, don't sit there and deliberate in response to what I'm asking you here. Write the first 12 things that come to mind. Don't let your pen break from the paper. So what would be your thoughts on that system 1 connection to maybe accessing the subconscious?
Yeah, in fact, that's probably the way that I would like to put it. And now, the metaphysics gets really warbly here because when we're talking about system 1, we're talking about the subconscious. What is that actually? Versus system 2, what is that actually? I'm not sure. But it's a helpful way to think about it. Yes, I would in fact probably equate the subconscious with the system 1. Yeah, that's kind of what I would say.
Yeah, that's we are kind of using our own heuristics here, right? Because system 1, there's no diagram of the brain that this. Exactly. I mean, you could break the brain down by parts, and maybe you could do scans and see more activity in the amygdala when there's prevailing system 1 thinking. But we're not talking about, system 1, system 2, subconscious. Yes, these are not actual things in reality. They're useful shortcuts.
He does specify that, I think, in the beginning of the book, that these things are some separate metaphysical entities from one another. So there's this other part in the book where he gives an example of Well, he's talking about knowledge. So it's a little bit about the philosophy that I disagree with.
Right.
And he gives the example of the financial crisis, the '08 financial crisis. And he says, paraphrasing, that it is the case that you had some experts that saw the financial crisis. You had some experts that didn't see the financial crisis. Therefore, the financial crisis is not something that could have been known beforehand. So he thinks this is, I call this the academic fallacy.
Right.
This is the idea that, well, if something is knowable, then the experts will know it, and they'll all agree on what it is. I think this is a very deep confusion about how the world works, right, and the differences in theories. So it's very possible that some small heterodox school of people who have a particular theory can actually predict, despite the majority consensus or lack of consensus, that this is what's going to happen, and they could be right about it. So it's kind of like the drug user, right? Somebody that is using a lot of drugs. You can know beforehand that one of two circumstances is possible. That if they're on heavy drugs, that either they're going to stop and they're going to have withdrawal, which is going to stink, or they're not going to stop and they're going to do damage, some kind of damage to their internal body, because hard drugs do that. So if you have a theory that says, look, I don't know exactly when you're going to have this correction, either you're going to stop using drugs and your body is going to go through withdrawal, or you're going to keep using drugs and you're going to cause internal damage to your body, at some point that heavy drug use is going to stop, whether it's by death or it's by voluntary choice. That's a theory. Now, I don't have specifics. I don't know when you're going to stop. I don't know when your liver is going to fail or your lungs are going to collapse. I don't know the specifics, but I have some way of predicting something in the future with, I think, a very high degree of accuracy. Mm-hmm. This is the case with economics. This is the analogy to the business cycle, right? You can know beforehand when the monetary base has exploded that you're going to have a boom and you're going to have a bust. You might not be able to know the specifics, but you can still have some theory that will help you predict financial crises. And I would say right now, put me on record, we are, I think, on the brink of having yet another financial crisis. Now, just because experts disagree doesn't mean that somehow the theory is unknowable. Just because two people who think they understand how the world works disagree doesn't mean that, oh, truth is non-existent, because if it were existent, everybody would agree. I think that's just very silly.
Yeah, and for us lay people, it goes to everybody's entitled to their opinion, right? It's a wash. It's
right.
There's no point in arguing about these things, and there's no point in either one of us taking each other incredibly seriously because the truth is unknowable. It's quite a dodge.
Exactly, and I'll give you one more example in religious thinking. So imagine that you're talking with a group of passionate Mormons, and in that community, you've got 30 different theologians, Mormon theologians, and they are all making mutually exclusive claims, and they find that maybe one of their fundamental claims is wrong in Mormonism. It would be akin to somebody saying, oh, look, all of the experts disagreed about Mormonism, and the world is kind of different than how they expect it to be. Therefore, reality is unknowable. You cannot know whether or not Mormonism is true or false. It's like, well, no, it's just in that particular group, there was a lot of really bad theories that some people agreed on some periphery things, they disagreed on other things, but they were all kind of foundationally mistaken. It's the same thing in economics. It's the same thing in astrology. It's the same thing in any field of thought. Just because people agree, the experts agree or disagree, really doesn't say anything about whether or not truth is knowable.
Isn't there a philosophical label that can be put to this phenomenon?
Yeah, something could be like Pyrrhonism, which is the old extreme Greek philosophic skeptics that said truth is unknowable. The cradlelist is another Greek philosophy that said there is no such thing as truth. But what's interesting about the cradlelists is, at least the main guy, I don't know about the proponents, but the main proponent of cradlelism acknowledged that if you're engaging in discourse, that you're presupposing the laws of logic. Yeah. And so his response was not to speak. he lived in a barrel outside of, I think, Athens, and didn't speak to anybody. He would do pantomime stuff.
That is a clever way around what is that? The stolen concept, or the self-detonating argument. I want to tell you how your ears lie to you. Oh, sure. That's commitment.
It is. It's consistency in one sense. To make a plug for my book here, my book, like I said, is about the laws of logic, but some people incorrectly think that the laws of logic are something like the laws of language or the laws of rationality. But I explain in the book, the laws of logic are actually the laws of existence. Mm-hmm. That for all existent phenomena, they exist the way that they do, and they don't exist in ways that they don't exist. Therefore, logic applies to everything. So the cradlelist isn't actually escaping the laws of logic by not speaking. He's bound by the laws of logic just by existing. So the only way for him to try to no longer be bound by the laws of logic would be to off himself, at which point he would cease existing, and therefore logic would no longer apply to him. And that's suggesting that anybody killed themselves, by the way. Right.
You don't have to go that far. The barrel is fine. Living in the barrel is fine. So before we wrap up today, I wanted to just do a bit of a lightning round from the second part of the book, which was called Heuristics and Biases, that has to do a lot with people's ability to analyze statistical information, or lack thereof, and logic as well. So I saw a couple that were relevant to our larger discussion here and our observations about what's been happening in the world. And one of the ones that struck me was from chapter 12. It was called The Science of Availability. And I thought about this in terms of people's exposure to media, people's media consumption, and also this kind of online insularity that people experience in Facebook groups. And I talked about this in a recent show, Reddit subthreads. The science of availability also relates to what is called availability cascades. That's the term that he uses, where as certain instances of something, and you just think about this in political terms, instances of something you're afraid of or something that you want to see happening start piling up because of how you insulate with media consumption or where you spend your time online, you start to believe more and more that this is the real world, that this is the only thing that can happen. And I think that has been partly responsible for a lot of the division that we've seen growing between, the two sides politically. This was a problem that's existed my whole life, but the arrival of social media really 10 years ago and, really escalating in the last 5 years has driven people to such opposite corners, because of this very phenomenon that I'm describing. Like, I only expose myself to these things, so these are the things not only that are happening, but this is the only thing that can happen, the things that I want to happen or the things that I'm afraid of happening, while there's, other people on the exact opposite side with, very, very different concerns, and they don't even really speak the same language anymore. They're not even, they're not connecting on reality in any substantial way.
Yes, you're exactly correct. When I was reading that, the media was just flashing, right? That this is exactly what the media is worst at, is promoting availability bias in the way that people think the world operates. An excellent example is something like school shootings or terrorist attacks, where whenever one happens, it makes the news for however many days. And in terms of absolute numbers, terrorist attacks and school shootings don't kill very many people compared to something like fatalities on the road. If you're worried about, oh gosh, is the world a dangerous place? People think, oh wow, terrorism and school shootings, that's a big problem, even though it might kill, less than 100 people every year. Versus driving kills 30,000 plus people every year. I mean, the magnitude of risk is completely disproportionate compared to what you see in the media versus, reality. The reality is driving is pretty dangerous. One of the most dangerous things you can do is drive, but you don't have a new news story, new sensationalist news story every time there's a fatality on the road, but you do whenever, somebody gets stabbed or shot somewhere. So people think it's a bigger problem than it actually is.
Indeed, and this is why so many of us, when we're young, are more afraid of getting in an airplane than we are getting in a car.
Exactly.
When an airplane falls out of the sky and crashes into the ground, it's a news event. When that happens, between cars, it isn't. So it really kind of skews the perception of reality. But I find as people in politics, which is a kind of a separate example because there's more division, right? And there's two alternate versions of reality being created. And in each version of reality, it's like, I don't want to say each one gets its own vocabulary, but vocabulary words are kind of redefined, right? So if you just look at the school shooting issue, people have this on the one side, like guns are the most dangerous things. Guns kill children in schools. On the other side, guns are a tool of protection. So we almost see like this frustration that comes about where people are using the same words and each side feels like they know what that word means, but they're bringing up like entirely different sets of emotions in each group of people who are at odds with each other, and then the frustration only increases because it's like everybody knows what this word means, and I'm using it, and you're interpreting it in a way like you're supposed to feel good or you're supposed to feel safe, and you feel bad and you feel in danger. What's going on here? You know?
Exactly. Yeah, and with the guns in particular, right? The left-wing individuals being scared of assault weapons, whatever that is. Now, of course, they never exactly define what that is.
Right.
When you look at the statistics, you could say high-powered rifles or something like that. It's a tiny fraction of gun-related deaths are from high-powered rifles. It's almost entirely handguns. And they say, oh, well, we don't want to ban handguns, although some of them want to ban handguns. We just want to do that. Nobody should have the AR-15 rifle or whatever it is. Well, it's like, actually, when you look at it, factually speaking, if the claim is that we're having too many gun-related deaths, the cause of those gun-related deaths is the existence of gun X, then you should probably try to ban gun X if you follow that line of reasoning, right? Of course, I don't. As a libertarian, I think that's a poor line of reasoning, but following their line of reasoning, then it would be, oh, therefore we need to ban handguns, and assault weapons is virtually a non-issue. But of course, the reality of the matter is assault weapons look scary. What they consider to be assault weapons. They look scarier. They cause more fear in people and say, oh, we got to ban those, rather than the actual cause of the problem, which one could very compellingly argue isn't the cause of the problem. Isn't the existence of weapons, it's the non-existence of weapons, because in case after case after case after case, these public shootings happen in gun-free zones for the reason precisely because they are gun-free, so the gunman can cause more damage. But that's another topic.
Yeah, you know what else is related to this? I saw a video a while back that you made. It was called Gender, Sex, and Language, right? Yeah. And you talked about, it's not exactly the same thing, but I think it's worth mentioning here. You talked about how groups of people talk past each other. And I might like you to go through that a little bit. You talked about this blue man, right? This blue man appears to tell people that he's blue, and it causes quite a bit of confusion.
Yeah. So I love that example. So imagine that imagine you and I are having a discussion, and I say, Brett, I got to be honest, I'm blue. And you say, well, what do you mean you're blue? I say, well, look, I'm just telling you, I have direct knowledge of the matter. I'm blue right now. And you say, Steve, no, you silly fool. You're not blue. What are you talking about? Are you an idiot? I say, what are you? And I say, Brett, that's very insensitive of you. I'm telling you I'm blue right now. How can you possibly say that I'm not blue? You're a jerk. You say, look, Steve, I'm looking straight at you, buddy. I am absolutely confident you are not blue. Mm-hmm. And if we could keep going back and forth like this, we're not going to make a lot of progress because we've not explained, well, what do you mean by blue? Right? When I say I'm blue, that means I'm feeling sad right now. I'm feeling melancholy. And the word that in your mind is, you're talking about my physical color. You say, Steve, you have white skin, you're not blue. That's silly. So we're just talking past each other. This happens all the time in dialogue. The example that in that context was talking about gender versus sex. Mm-hmm. So when a lot of the confusion, I think, comes down to, well, what do you mean by sex? What do you mean by gender? Right? Most people, when they're talking about gender, are talking about biology. They're talking about genitals. Right? So they say, look, you are a man if you have male genitalia. That's the way that it is. People on the other side are saying, look, I have a self-image of being, let's say, more feminine, regardless of my particular genitalia. So they say, look, I am a woman. And then you have the same dialogue. You're not a woman. I am a woman. But they're not talking about the same thing. One's talking about their internal experience. The other talking about objective biology. I think that causes all kinds of confusion. This happens in philosophy, shot throughout philosophy, as nobody defines exactly what they're talking about, so everybody talks past each other.
Yeah, it brings us back to what we were talking about earlier in this conversation with this college campus crisis, right? People succumb to their, availability cascades, where one group says we're oppressed or we're victims or everybody is a bigot. And, they go and they seek examples of that. And it becomes more and more, it seems to become more and more likely. So when somebody from the other side shows up who is, subject to their own availability cascades of everybody's an SJW, this college is filled with language police, they're trying to shut down free speech, and then they, collide and try to use words to talk without ever talking about what those words mean and getting clarity on definitions, it's just a disaster, right? So,
yes. It's
same
an
idea.
Explosion of emotions. Have you seen the video of, I think his name's Jordan Peterson. He's a professor from Canada talking with some social justice warriors.
I've heard this name. I think this has come up in my news feeds. Tell me a little bit about it.
So he's a professor. I don't remember which university it is, somewhere in Canada, and he's like making the rounds now in U.S. media because everybody wants to talk to him. And he's on tape trying to have a rational discussion with some social justice warriors that are accusing him of bigotry and whatever. And she's trying to say, look, like, I want to respect you, but I disagree with some of these things. Let's have a rational discussion. And they're just exploding, like they're emotionally exploding in his face because he's not towing the line. He's not saying the things that they assume he's supposed to say, and therefore they assume he's a bigot and has all these bad feelings. Yeah, they have all these bad feelings against him because they're doing exactly what you just mentioned. In that circumstance, I think there's a great deal of talking past one another. Again, there's just talking past one another. And the trouble is, because it's so emotional on both sides, people don't like being discriminated against, and people don't like being called bigots when they're not bigots. You have this kind of, atomic explosion. I think I've used the word atomic twice today. That's where I usually don't use that word. But you have this explosion where you can see in real time very clearly in that circumstance, the social justice left was very, very far away from making any kind of progress in rational discourse, which drives people. I might say one of the unintended consequences of the social justice crusading is to make people bigots.
Yeah.
Right? So what I think will happen, and I'm sure is happening, is people are going to end up not liking transgender people because they associate transgenderism with being called a bigot all the time. It's like, oh yeah, that group of people, they insist that I hate them. Well, yeah, they're kind of obnoxious about them. Maybe I do hate them. I think that's something that you're going to see happen just because people are so fed up with having mud thrown at them all the time. When, like, for example, that community, the label is no longer LGBT, it's LGBTQIAA plus to add in all the other groups. Well, you can be called a bigot for something that you don't even know exists. So, for example, like, I don't know, if you, this is actually a better example. In the transgender world, there are what's called otherkin, people that self-identify as mythical creatures. Mm-hmm. So they identify as elves or nymphs or whatever it is. Now, if you're not following this, you may not even be aware that that is the case, but you might be, some cisgendered otherkin bigot. It's like somebody will call you some crazy name, some ist that you've never heard. It's not racist or sexist or genderist. It's some other ist. It's like, I don't even know. You're accusing me of having bigotry against a group of people I don't even know exist.
Yeah.
That's a problem. It's frustrating as hell, too.
Indeed. Well, I think one of the things that I'm trying to point out in this series of shows that I've been doing that we're, a part of right now is that a shortcut, as you were telling the story about Jordan Peterson, my thinking is, like, how much, even though it doesn't have much to do with what we're talking about, I just think it's fair to say to the people who are accosting him, or in defense of the people who are accosting him, how much does kind of like a mob mentality factor into a lot of these things that we see on video? Because I've seen people who have what I consider to be very irrational and disconnected from reality type views spoken to one-on-one, not where they're ganging up on one person that they see as a bigot. And the conversation has a very different tone. Even if you don't reach an accord at the end, it looks very different. So what I wanted to try and point out in this series is that the shortcut that we're seeing a lot of people take in politics, in social media, in a lot of these interactions in higher education, is making these things properties of people, right? So you're right. People will identify behavioral attributes and kind of shift them into being properties of people. These transgenders, they all act like this, right? Because that's easy. That's simple. That's a nice, neat package to work with. People really seem to enjoy finding and using those shortcuts. So while I go after, that very group of people, the SJWs and, their opponents on the right and the alt-right, I want to make sure that we're really focusing on the behaviors, kind of auditing behaviors, and not just, collecting them into groups of people, because that's what is happening across the world right now, certainly in this country.
It's an excellent point, and I love the term shortcut, because that implies, look, you're not actually being careful about it. And it's true, right? If you on my show, I have a podcast called Patterson and Pursuit, and I have every intention, hopefully in the short run, of having people on the transgender discussion come on board and talk about things calmly, because my suspicion is when you act like you say, when you talk to people one-on-one, then in very short order, it becomes less plausible to think, oh, this person I'm talking to is just a bad bigot. It's like somebody we got to get, that mob mentality. That's the out group, we got to get them. If it's just one-on-one, it's like, look, I think I can demonstrate within the matter of 15 minutes that not a bigot, don't really care about your personal choices. I want to know about what you're talking about. And I may disagree with some of the things you say, but that doesn't mean I'm a bad person. And you don't get that when you have the mob mentality, both on the left and the right. And libertarians, of course, we do this all the time. We're talking about statists, right? There's this group of statists that's out there. They get everything wrong. Those bad people. Well, that's a shortcut.
Yeah, indeed. And that was another one of the goals of working through a lot of these subjects is, I spend time on Facebook and Twitter, and a lot of these behavioral attributes that are typically attached to the social justice left by people on the right and by libertarians, and these other horrible behaviors and attitudes that the social justice left attaches to, people who are conservatives. I see a lot of libertarians engaging in these behaviors kind of unconsciously in social media and elsewhere as well. So I said, hey, look, let's step back and let's try to point out the things that, yes, social justice left, or the Richard Spencer and the alt-right and what they're up to, but let's kind of evaluate ourselves and see if we don't say, look at what X group does or look at what Y group does, and we say, look at what the doing is. We have a better chance of assessing ourselves. So that's what we're shooting for.
It's well put. And let me bring this full circle, bringing it back to thinking fast and slow and libertarianism. So one of the cases of cognitive bias that he talks about that libertarians fall into incredibly strongly is called theory-induced blindness. And a lot of libertarians fall into this for economic reasons, because I think they misinterpret what you can do with Austrian economics, and I think they do it incorrectly. But let me give you an example of theory-induced blindness. This points to a deeper philosophic issue of rationalism versus empiricism. How do you know about the world? Is it by understanding your own concepts, or is it by going out and experimenting in the real world? So this is an example that comes from Square One, the book that just came out. In poker, you can understand the principles of poker, where you can dominate somebody who doesn't understand the principles of poker fairly easily. So let's say, if we're playing Texas Hold'em, in my hand I've got an ace-ace, and in your hand you've got a 2-7, and before the flop comes down, before any other cards are on the board, I get you to go all in. Well, I've made an objectively superior move, right? I have you, it's like an 85% chance that I'm going to win that hand. That is the correct play in poker. And it's about odds, right? Stronger poker hands means you have better odds of winning. Okay. So the rationalist says, I can grasp what poker just by understanding the concepts involved. It's about mathematics, essentially. So the correct play is to keep beating you, or to keep getting you with these 85%, 90% odds. However, what happens if in the course of you and I playing poker, you keep having worse cards than I do, but you keep winning? So imagine, I got this ace, and you have a 2-7, but a couple of 2s come down on the flop, and you beat me with 3 of a kind. Okay, it's a one shot, it's a one-off thing. It happens as part of variance, no big deal. But let's say it keeps happening, and it keeps happening, and it keeps happening. With different hands, I have way better hands than you, but you keep beating me. Mm-hmm. So the rationalist might say, well, it doesn't matter how long. This could go on for years. It doesn't matter how long. I understand the game of poker completely, and I'm not going to adjust my theory based on the data because you just keep getting lucky. However, it actually becomes more reasonable to abandon that theory of poker and think, well, maybe one of my presuppositions was wrong. Maybe I have theory-induced blindness, where a more plausible explanation than you just keep getting lucky for 5 years in a row is that we're not actually playing the game of poker that I thought we were playing. You're cheating. So the deck that we're using, for example, might not be the standard 52-card deck. It might be that in your sleeve you keep extra cards so that you can keep winning. Those explanations, the longer it keeps going on, the longer you keep beating me, the more reasonable it is to say, okay, though I understand the game of poker, there's additional variables at play. And you're not going to fall into sticking your head in the sand with theory-induced blindness and say, look, like, we are definitely playing the game of poker and you just keep getting lucky. That's actually no longer a reasonable explanation for your beating me. There's these other variables at play. Libertarians do this all the time. When we're talking about economics, we're talking about the business cycle in particular, we'll say, look, it's just a matter of time before we have the financial collapse. These institutions are going to go belly up. We're going to have inflation that's going to reach this percent, and it's just got to be that case. It's like, well, actually, no. That's theory-induced blindness. There are other variables that you're not taking into account in your theoretical understanding about how the world works that actually you're not playing the game that you think that you're playing. So you see that all the time. It's not just unique to libertarians. You see this across the board in all political ideologies, but it's especially pronounced with libertarians. We get stuck onto the theory and sometimes are unaware of variables that we're not taking into account.
Human variables.
Yes.
Absolutely. Well said. All right, let's leave it there. I really appreciate you coming back on the show, and I want to have you back in the near future to do like a long-form discussion about the book, but it is available now, so I want to let people know how they can get it.
Yep, you can go to Amazon. You can get it. It's Kindle. In a few days, there will be a paperback version. And you can also, if you like the work that I'm doing, you can go to patreon.com/Steve Patterson. And if you become a patron of the work that I'm producing, you also get a free book. You get Square One, which is free. And you also get my previous book, What's the Big Deal About Bitcoin? You also get that for free.
Awesome. Steve, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thanks, Brett. My pleasure.